This is Shatadru again with our podcast number 2. Today we have a very interesting subject to talk about. It is on business and human rights, which is an essential frame for discussing the broader context of global and local dynamics. These dynamics highlight the pressing importance of our conversation today in a rapidly globalizing world. Our dialogue is driven by a recognition of increasing instances of human rights challenges associated with business activities. These challenges encompass a spectrum of issues from labor practices that raise ethical questions to environmental concerns, issues of land acquisition, displacement of communities, and the continuation of trade practices that may not be always equitable. It's important to note that these challenges are not only a reflection of individual business actions, but also of broader systemic structures that unfortunately often disadvantage the most vulnerable group in our society. The growing emphasis on corporate responsibility, as illustrated by initiatives such as European Union Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, EUCSDD, as we know it, is further a significant evolution towards integrating human rights at the heart of business operation. The podcast aims to dissect this complex dynamics, offering insights into how businesses can navigate the evolving landscape of human rights obligations. Today, we have with us probably one of the most noted names in the space of corporate social responsibility, sustainability, human rights, my very own mentor, and one of the founding fathers of sustainability in our country, Mr. Viraf Mehta. Thank you, Viraf, for taking time out and joining all the way from Ladakh, where you are right now based.
Indeed.
Maybe I could start with you on a question, which is to introduce the subject of business and human right. Can you demystify the concept of business and human right for us in a simple terms? And additionally, would you be able to share how these concepts have intertwined with various stages of your own personal journey?
Okay, well, pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for a very kind introduction. I think you and I go back nearly 20 years now. So I think that in the late 80s and very early 90s, in terms of a journey, it's very relevant to, I think, anything we discuss ahead, because I was placed, number one, in a situation where an issue that you mentioned, land acquisition, with the extractive industries in a mining steel company. And the prefix of that company, of course, is Tata. The early point of at least my career, which was India's entry into globalization and liberalization. The reforms accompanying that, the need to compete as a steel plant, for example, with 80,000 people when we needed half that number, and so forth. So I think that the first time that we confronted in the corporate responsibility and accountability field the terminology of rights out of the United Nations, as you know. The United Nations Global Compact, Principles 1, 2, and so forth are labor rights, human rights, concepts at that time such as complicity, fear of influence, and so forth. And then bribery and corruption, which again is no less than a human rights issue, was brought in. However, I think that, as you know, there was a parallel movement in the United Nations to look at transnational companies in particular, their massive impacts, and to develop some sort of UN norms. And that died a death in 2005 because of various reasons. And it was at that juncture, I think, that really, at least from our side as a developing country, being confronted with how we were going to participate or navigate whatever was going to evolve in this field. But by 2006, it was clear that one had to make a choice. I had to make a choice. So it was clear to me that what we would see was still these silos of environment, corporate governance, and ethics, and so forth. And the big word S, social, which seemed to subsume everything, whether it's workers' rights, whether it's community rights, whether it's consumers, environment, and so forth. These silos, we had to conceptualize what business and human rights meant in simple terms, and as you've inquired, how to demystify this. Had I the benefit of the hindsight we now have over a decade after the release of the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights in 2011 would be more correctly a human rights-based approach. That's the phrase that I adopt. And if I'm speaking with business, many people get the idea that business and human rights or the addition of human rights is something new. Some people will go the other extreme, saying it was always there, so what's new in what we have to do? And I think that the answer to this is, first of all, to business, whether you're looking at any issue in your business to do with your impacts on people or the environment, that you pick up and utilize human rights as the lens through which you analyze the root causes of the things that you're looking at, and that minimum requirement for business is that you do no harm. And if you do, then you take steps to correct it, or you allow for or you create opportunities for redressal and remedy. I think this is a wonderful thing because in this global world, the human rights-based approach have things that no other lens could possibly provide. And without going into basics there, to my mind, it's good for business because we're not asking business to address every single global social or environmental problem that exists. We agree upon a minimum that you attempt to do no harm or stand in the way of people realizing their rights. I think for all of us who were struggling with this issue in the period about 2010-11, just around the time the UNGPs were released, it was certainly the case in India that business were not educated about human rights. For myself, I think the faith didn't come from whether there would be an uptake by business or the state would follow or the courts would follow or remedy mechanisms would activate themselves, but it came from, I think, a faith arising out of the fact that we are demographically the youngest nation in the world. Our young people are highly connected network-wise and social media-wise to everything that's happening. And I think that if you look at how they think, these words, human rights, they don't bat an eyelid. They're not afraid of these words. They are happy to support these words. And from the point of view of victims, of which there are millions in our country, I had no doubt that the way to appeal to them, to reach out to them, to one way or the other, support the idea that we will stand for their rights, educate them of their rights, was the only way that forward. And in this polarized, charged world, there's a power imbalance. So the human rights agenda, in that sense, rested with activists. And activists had their own space. So whether you're an activist for RTI, the right to information, and the number of people who've lost their lives fighting for that right, or you're an activist that is against the spread of mining activities into sacred forests, you get a label and you're a human rights activist. If you look at the best of our NGOs at that time, it was a moot point to debate whether NGOs themselves had a rights-based approach. Nevertheless, today, human rights is an integral part of any corporate accountability and responsibility discourse anywhere. And that this transformation has come from words being objected to, from it being its association with a type of activism, to a point in time where the Indian guidelines have absorbed these. There's a mandatory framework of reporting for listed Indian companies.
This is so enlightening. You mentioned about several activities, several mechanisms that came into being to address the business and human right related issues. But what we have seen is for a very long time till recently, the emphasis has been around voluntary mechanisms of implementing human rights. But of late, we are seeing that there is a kind of a movement from such a voluntary mechanism to a mandatory mechanism, primarily through the new EU Corporate Sustainability Directive that is mandating human rights consideration within the supply chain. Do you see that this will lead to a kind of a greater uptake of or integration of human rights issues within supply chain? Or do you see it will lead to kind of more of a compliance-driven mindset, and as a result, which will have a limited effect? Viraf, over to you.
Okay, look, there's nothing voluntary about respecting human rights at all. However, you're right. I think that we had a phase where business always, its standard position was, let me self-regulate. So I think there are layers of analysis required here. But having said that, I think that there's critical mass of business argue for a level playing field and mandatory norms help with that. So if you look at quite a remarkable thing that we did in India was when the first state commission guidelines, national voluntary guidelines, NVGs, were formulated and released. Yes, they had a pillar on human rights and so forth, but the whole guidelines per se were voluntary. But by the next year, 2012, for the first 100 listed companies, it became mandatory to report on voluntary guidelines. So it was actually even the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct, which was the update of the NVGs. Yes, it dropped the V word, but they're still voluntary guidelines, except now that the biggest of companies, the top 1,000 listed companies, have just a few months ago, for the first time in corporate governance CSR history in our nation, released their BRSR reports, which are based on the 9 principles of the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct. This is the first time. We have had annual reports, financial reports, for how long? A century and more. And we have had non-financial data, such as what we're discussing today, including human rights, for the first time by the top 1,000 companies mandated by SEBI, and you can challenge those reports if they're in the public domain, free of cost. You can translate them, you can challenge them, you can improve the reporting, you can choose your role. I stress this not to put any particular framework on a pedestal, but from a firm conviction that without the right to information, how can you proceed? But having said that, how do you take non-financial data to the grassroots, to the producers, for example, to the smallholders and farmers, and say, look, this is an account of the companies from what they sourced from you. The second miraculous transformation has been that every time we spoke of businesses or corporates, in fact, the UNGP's Pillar 2 talks about a corporate responsibility to respect human rights. When we drafted the Indian ones, we used the word business, not corporate. Business responsibility to respect, and we added a word. Can you imagine the only country that did so in a national guideline? To respect and promote human rights. Where to promote human rights? Amongst where vulnerable people exist. So, what was this miraculous change? And today, when we say business, we talk in the national guidelines endorsed by the government of India of the value chain, not supply chain, not global supply chain, value chain. And you know the difference and the import of using the value chain. So when I say business would fight back and say, that's not my legal responsibility. The notion that companies have a duty of care, an obligation, and now increasingly legally for at least downstream supply chain issues is welcome. And this is what due diligence is all about. Whether you do due diligence in a financial way, all we're saying is now you do non-financial due diligence. Whether existing components, mandatory components in India, for example, EIAs, SIAs, and now do you want an HRIA separately, impact assessment? I say no. I say we especially, I say this on behalf of small and medium enterprise here. My focus is not only large corporations. If we learn the language of SMEs, understand their mindset, their reality, their challenges, and how to take this agenda to them, then at least a piece of that puzzle is to get corporations or the state, of which such SMEs are part of their value chains, to bear some of the cost of their capacity building, their understanding of these issues, and not to position these as just a policing or as an audit-driven exercise. This will lead nowhere. My sense is that the way that plays out, in one instance, we have always said that irrespective of what our business partners do or EU does, we as the most populous, one of the largest economies on earth, have to do this for ourselves. So we're better prepared not to comply with European or American or Canadian or any other legislation, but to be in sync through our own systems. India is not going to accept dictates of human rights from other countries, is not going to be pressured into compliance. But neither can India ignore the fact that it would be in its interest to develop a national action plan on human rights in business. I think that our interest in our agenda is for business, for example, to be aware that these human rights issues are being debated and there are ways to look at them. And that's the point of national action plans, that if we produce a national action plan on business and human rights, it's good for business because it has a roadmap. It's a risky agenda. Even in human rights due diligence, you can spend millions of dollars on it and it doesn't yield impact. So I think before you can pass on some of these costs to the consumer who thinks that this is a human rights friendly product up to tier 1 maybe and pays an extra cost. But at the level of measuring impact in terms of not cleansing the supply chain and chasing children away into more dangerous places below the radar if that exploitation is going to go deeper, but to accept it and to work with it, not to hide it, not to be ashamed of disclosing it, but being able to provide evidence that you are year by year through our BRSR reporting. We ask last year's performance, we ask your target, we ask where you are, why you've fallen short, and it's a partnership for human rights. But I think if we're 2024 today, the SDGs, India is still 6 years away. We have time to do things. And we would argue, ultimately, that if you accept 80-90% of all SDGs and their targets, a goal cannot be achieved without understanding the human rights components that underlie them, underpin them, then I think that we begin to see the value of a human rights-based approach. Lastly, October 2022, not that long ago, for the first time, United Nations have mooted the notion that we have a human right to a safe and healthy environment. If the passage of a rights-based approach lens is applied to environment, then we can seek redressal, remedy, compensation for inaction on an environmental issue that affects everyone in terms of air quality, for example. So I don't think it's in ESG at all. I reject that ESG formulation. So I think that the S part simply doesn't do justice to human rights at all, unless explicitly stated.
But this is a perfect bridge to the next question. There is a gap regarding social and environmental issues. Environmental sustainability is often perceived in terms of conservation and resource management, while social issues are seen through the lenses of human rights, social justice, without recognizing the inherent linkages between the two. But it is not just restricted to this perception. If we see the disciplinary division, it has generated a kind of a silo effect, with each field developing its own methodologies, terminologies, intervention strategies, making interdisciplinary collaboration challenging. How do you see this tendency to kind of separate the green agenda from the human right agenda, even in terms of interventions and research and different methodologies?
I lived in a time earlier during my business working days in Jharkhand, for example, parts of West Bengal, parts of Orissa, when hunting was legal. I stood before the forest department, between the forest department, who had guns raised, and I stood with my friends on the other side who were hunters from the tribal community. And the issue was, the forest department says, you may not hunt. It's illegal now in India. You can't, thousands of you, go on a rampage and kill animals and birds on this 1 or 2 days when this festival took place. And this festival had been going on for thousands and thousands of years. But modern day law and urban activists, no, you may not kill a peacock and you may not kill a bird and you may not hunt. Did the tribal people who had conserved these forests and all the living beings within them and knew to such intricate detail every bit about that animal, plant and insect life that ever moved in those forests, which alien activists and forest department people had no clue about, frankly. And you were going to tell them about their right, their cultural right to hunt, or you were going to take it away forcibly, and you were prepared to engage in conflict to defend your own position. Now, legally, of course, the forest department were right. Environmental laws prohibited this. On the other extreme, without any doubt, the tribal people were the best to manage their own forest that had been seized from them. And what am I doing in the middle? Am I business? Am I an anthropologist? But I'm hired by business, so yes, I am business in that sense. What's our role? And why should we care about what happens in this issue? It's between the state and the locals. Why get involved? I got involved also because we were supporting a number of environmental issues like Save the Elephant, Save the Tiger, and so forth. And possibly it was good for us to know what the reality of these forests were, and that if these forests were, the tribals actually threatened to burn the forests, raze it to the ground rather than surrender. And if we lost that forest, we lost, well, our lungs. We couldn't breathe. So anyhow, we came to certain conclusions and mechanisms to resolve what on the one hand was an environmental and a wildlife issue. And I've said a rights-based approach, human, labor, but now you force me to say animal. You had to be able to find a way to take a middle path. And human rights as a lens. Otherwise, I would never have been seen as a honest broker between the two if I took sides. It's easy to take sides. I mean, ActionAid said at that time, we take sides. Yes, I understand what you mean. But what you require here is conflict resolution. And a conflict resolver has to be informed, but not take sides. So we introduced an artificial hunt. We negotiated the number of animals, rules for them, and then there was an archery competition where every village was assured of meat, otherwise they hardly got anything, and so forth. So it's not enough to say it's legal, and that's why with business it's not enough to say I follow the law. That's no answer in human rights terms. In human rights terms, I don't think that, for example, clean air, an environmental issue, cleaning it up leads to an improvement in human rights. I think it is the decision to insist upon your human rights that leads to a cleanup of the air. The fracture, it seems to me, is that we have we have organizations in India that work on consumers. And if you want to discuss the human rights elements of a sustainable consumption, then I'm afraid that our starting point will have to be how you consume and how you actually adversely impact somebody else's consumption or ability to consume even a minimum, because you don't pay them a living wage or a fair wage, and your consumption actually drives their poverty. We are the polluters. What steps do we need to take to consume more sustainably, human rights wise, and if you like, at the same time, environmentally? And I would argue that the crux of the problem at this point in time is insufficient speed at which we're still able to externalize the cost of these issues, but the economic system, right down to your income tax, all the taxes you pay, to the cost of a house, cost of credit, cost of capital, taking a loan, your usage is integrated completely into the economic, which is why our national guidelines and this discourse is still, in a sense, incomplete. It's not human rights, environment, and governance. It's economic first.
This was exactly what I was trying to ask you. In fact, that's a very nice bridge again to the economic component from the environmental component. That brings us to briefly, Viraf, if you can share, a company or a business, as we call it, not paying a remunerative wage or not paying a remunerative price to its supplier, does it violate human rights?
Of course it does. As does bribery and corruption. And not paying a fair wage is exploitation, is it not? Exploitation. It's like saying trafficking is a non-starter. So I think that before we say pay a fair wage, we have to say that the non-payment of a fair wage causes a girl child to be forced out of school, for a woman maybe who's not working to be forced into prostitution, for a disabled child to be completely neglected in that family, for them to be trapped in debt by going to a moneylender, and all the evils that we know of in our nation that are ready to prey on vulnerable people. So if we make them economically vulnerable, on the plus side, if we don't teach them how to save money, how to have a bank account, how to operate a fair loan, financial literacy aspects, particularly women, the man might earn more and get a living wage and spend it all on gambling and drinking. And where's the woman? Now look, in the West, you may have a nuclear family and the children are away at 16 and there's the husband and wife as a definition of a family. And the human rights impact doesn't happen. But in India, with joint families, with extended families, come on. And with a dependence in a patriarchal society on the male breadwinner and so forth, the restrictions in certain communities for a woman to go out and work rather than prefer to work at home. These are our domestic realities. We have to operate successfully within that. An extreme non-understanding of, for example, homeworking realities. Should some companies say no homeworking? If we find it, out. Some say, let's work with the reality of homeworking and improve it. Now, where do you stand on the issue? I stand on the behalf, my analysis begins with human rights, on what that person wants and what that family wants and what that community permits and what is best in their socio-economic. Now, can it make business sense as well? To my mind, it might even drive down costs not to have establishments. If you really costed the woman taking a bus and her footprint, carbon footprint, getting to work and commuting and wasting time, if she's getting more time with the children, but it's done safely at home and so forth, then from a human rights perspective and from an environmental and from an economic, there's a win-win. Look, I honestly believe, and this has been all my work right through it, that you can design such a thing, that it is in fact possible. They are not mutually antagonistic. And if you know how to design that in a way and make three business cases, therefore, the consumer, the business, and the community or labor, how can it not transform the marketplace?
But that raises a question. If I have to play a role, if I am a small factory owner exporting to Europe, I am suffering losses. And I have been under tremendous pressure from Germany, let's say, who are already implementing their due diligence regulation and asking me to apply human rights requirements within my factory. Now, what would be your suggestion to me? What would be my business case? What would be my reason to follow the different components of human rights in my business operations in India? How do I convince? How do you convince me, or how do I convince a kind of a small group? Because they are worried that probably the values of human rights I fully align with, but it doesn't go well along with the business logic, because if I don't make loss, if I start making losses, how do I take care of several other aspects? Is there a business case for human rights, in other words, for such players?
Does there need to be? I think I would like to see as a beginning, and we have a good chance of doing this, negative rights. There must be no child labor. There must be no forced labor. There must be no sexual harassment. And I think I would like to see the government, as the largest business person in the country, in our country, in the public sector, through public procurement, do some experiments here. We have an association in India of public procurement professionals of India, and they are the guys who decide who to procure from. And their tenders are just, the usual cost and quality and a few other imperatives, but no sustainability. And so a whole procurement system, we must at the one hand be willing, and the state can do this, it can afford to do so, provide a fair price for a compliant organization. And the metrics, by the way, what somebody would use, we can't expect the factory owner that you mentioned to be compliant with a global GRI type of thing. No. In fact, as part of the expert committee on BRSR and business disclosure, we had developed, I was a member of that committee, and we had developed a version of disclosure for small, medium enterprise that we tested with local SMEs across different sectors, not sufficiently, but as a dipstick test in terms of whether these questions were relevant, whether they had capacities to build them up and so forth. So here's my thinking. I think it's an error in that sense to isolate human rights and ask if it has a business case or a cost. It actually does not. If you accept a wider definition of what I would call a quality of a product. So the social quality of a product and the environmental quality of a product. Quality systems, our SMEs have understood for 20 years. We've had quality councils and quality certifications and all the rest of it. But the notion of a good quality product, expand the queue and integrate human rights, key human rights concerns and environmental ones into that definition of quality. And so in the design of a quality product, I've got to be there on the table, but the sustainability professionals, as you know, and the human rights professionals in companies. Come on. Are they really sitting in the boardroom and influencing decisions there? Are they really as empowered as the legal teams and the finance people and the marketing and sales people? Are they really changing the way that their procurement works? So how can then the business case be made?
Thank you, Virav. That was a fascinating discussion. Now, we are coming to the last part of the questions, and I am trying a new component in that, which is called a rapid fire round. I'm pretty sure you can handle that.
Okay.
So, the most challenging decision you have made in your career as a human rights expert, Virav?
Well, to take up human rights.
I say. That brings us to the second question. One thing, one achievement, or one milestone you are most proud of in your extensive career, Virav, in your human rights journey?
Without doubt. The fact that if I went back to dozens of villages I could name in Jharkhand, Orissa and Bengal, not having been there for 25 years, then not only would people recognize me, they would welcome me, and I would be delighted to hear their stories and once again offer whatever I had and hope that they thought that at least in the time that we served made a difference that they value. That's it. Back to the heart.
Thank you. What kind of human right practices one can incorporate in our everyday life? If we have to say 3 or 5 of practices that could be incorporated for a common person not really understanding sustainability or in this discipline?
Well, it depends on how much risk you're prepared to take. First of all, as a starting point, I don't want to be a fighter and a champion of my own rights. I have to show some evidence that other people's rights, even if I disagree with them, I have to defend. So I think what you're asking is, what I'm saying is that at some point on a daily basis, I have to be a human rights defender. Interfering here and anywhere else is risky business, isn't it? But I think there are helplines and quiet ways of interfering. If I see a wrong practice, I don't go up and just deal with it there and then get into a fight. But I'll report it if I have a connection. And if I have a network, all of us are privileged. We are educated. We have much more realization of our human rights than our brothers and sisters. And if we don't use our influence, our network, you may not work on child rights, but if you see a domestic worker being sexually exploited or a child out of school in your neighbor's thing, you should call HelpAge or Child Rights or make an anonymous call and intervene. You cannot enjoy your own human rights if you don't defend those of others.
And how about your own consumption practices, your own
what the hell? This is penance. After 20 years in Delhi and a dozen before in Jamshedpur, I'm aware of how much I consumed in my travels. 60 flights a year, 80 flights a year. In the time we worked together, my friend, it's down to 10. I don't own a car. I don't commute. My consumption, unfortunately, we have no control, is energy. So in every way, the clothes I wear, their life cycle, same spectacles for 8 years. And part of shifting to Ladakh was not to get peace of mind or because I love the mountains. It is the price that I'm obliged to pay for what I have consumed. Till, like in karma, that slate is clean. And so I'm aware that here, I don't cause human rights risks. I don't keep domestic labor. I've eliminated certain things from the diet as much as I can, looking at its footprint. And of course, it's more sustainable than living in Delhi. So I'm very happy to spend a decade here, or whatever's left of this lifetime, to fall in sync with the way things work here, not as bringing a Delhi lifestyle to Ladakh.
And that brings us to the last question on the rapid fire round. And that is, if you had the power to change one global business practice overnight to better support human rights, what would it be? Just one.
I think we already have the answer. What I'd like to see is that the governance of the company, the board, has a representative. They are called independent directors. But not only is there representation of stakeholders, directly in the board, meaning that farmer in the hut, the tribal person, has access to the board and is represented their voice on the board in a way that if it's ignored, there's a liability amongst board members and strictures. Whether it's a fine or imprisonment or what type of strictures you have is another matter. The issue has got to be there with the same force as with the investor sitting there. And so it's not shareholder versus stakeholder. We have a share too. Why should you call yours a share and mine a stake? What nonsense is this? If you want, I'll buy one share of your company. But I've got to be right there where that's the change I'd like to see. I think I'd like to see the sort of corporate leaders we once had, and we don't today, on social issues, environmental issues.
Thank you so much, Viraf, for this very enlightening discussion. I think we have come to the end of this call. Now, viewers, with the Indian enterprises increasingly making their mark internationally, the integration of human rights principles, not only a regulatory requirement but also a strategic priority, something which clearly comes out from our discussion with Viraf. This integration is crucial for fostering ethical governance, promoting sustainable development, and advancing social justice. Thank you for listening through this intriguing conversation, and I'm looking forward to come back to you with our next version very soon. Thank you very much.
A pleasure. Most welcome, and catch up soon again. Thank you.
Thank you, Viraf. Bye-bye.